Hello, greetings and welcome. This is Alchemy, the first show of 2017, and it's great to have your company. Wherever you might be, wherever you're listening from, you're all equally welcome. Don't be shy as well. We have an online community on Facebook and Twitter. You can find us there and say hello to us. Of course, we exist thanks to your very kind donations. So thank you to everybody who does so via our website. We're completely non-profit and intend to stay that way. So, on to the show. Alchemy. This episode, we see the return of David Icke. David has been with me on several occasions in the past, and we always have a most interesting and enlightening discussion, and I'm sure this will be no exception. So, David, how are you? You're welcome back to Alchemy.
I'm very good, John. In fact, I don't think I've ever been better. The interest in the work that I do and the information and the ongoing world tour, which will be in Ireland shortly, as I've never known anything like it. And, I've been doing this now for 27 years, and it's reaching a point now where you can see people in very significant numbers looking at the world in a different way. Sometimes it's in a most, if you like, 5 cents level. We're sick of the European Union, we're getting out. But more and more people are opening themselves to really deep levels of concepts and understanding which they would have waved aside with a laugh not so long ago.
Well, that's very interesting, and you've kind of touched on Brexit there, which I would like to talk about, because 2016 saw a lot of changes. I mean, Brexit being one, it was kind of an anti-establishment vote. You look at Donald Trump being elected against all the mainstream odds, if you're that way inclined. I think most people expected Hillary Clinton, and the mainstream media certainly pushed for Clinton to be elected. So in terms of that, do you think it's a genuine shift, or do you think it could be the case that we've been sold a pup in a sense, and that Trump maybe isn't as genuine as he seems to be in terms of being anti-establishment? I've been looking at some of his cabinet appointments with interest there. And then with Brexit as well, could it be that this is actually part of a greater plan or a greater scheme? Or do you think it's something organic? I'm very interested in your views on this.
Well, I think it's both in this sense. People are in ever greater numbers getting sick and tired of just following along like the one in front. Vast numbers of people still do that, of course, but there are significant numbers who were like that before, who are now saying, we're not having this anymore. We're not being dictated to, and we're not being told what to think and what to do, and we're not having our lives in fine detail more and more imposed upon. And when people have had the opportunity to express that, and of course it's very difficult to do that in a political election in, for instance, Britain, because you're being offered, and history has shown that to be the case, very blatantly masks on the same face. In other words, take the rhetoric away, and there's not a cigarette paper between any of them, really, in terms of their basic thrust and the way they see the world and economics and all the rest of it. But with Brexit, given the fact that it was a referendum with two choices, you actually could give your choice without having to go through a political party where it would never be seen again, probably, because, of course, what they tell you they're going to do to get into power is rarely what they do when they get into power. But this referendum overrode that, and I think was and I think there's a reason why it was shocking to the establishment and took them aback, is that elections do not give you the opportunity to do that in Britain, most other countries, because of what I'm talking about. But this referendum did, and that's what shocked them, because the people had the opportunity to express how they felt, which is they're sick of dark suit bureaucrats in Brussels imposing themselves in more and more fine detail upon the lives of everyone else. In terms of Trump, I think that was the same. The difference, I think, though, is that the reason so many voted for Trump against all the odds was not because of what Trump is. Trump is not going to drain the swamp. He's standing in it. that what got him the support was the perception that he was an anti-establishment, the perception that he was for the, if you like, the common man, as people wrongly call themselves. That was the, if you like, the barometer of where people were at in terms of why they voted for him. But as I said, on the very day that he was elected, they're all going to be very disappointed because he's not what he seemed to be. But in terms of, like I say, a barometer on the public mood, the fact that they voted for someone they thought was outside the establishment was very much in line with the mentality and the motivations behind Brexit. But of course, as you rightly say, since that day he was elected, the swamp drainer has just got the hosepipe out and started filling it.
Yeah.
And the most significant thing, and I think most people are missing this when they're getting pulled into other things, the most important aspect of Trump is that he is 100% owned by Israel, owned in his mind as well as possibly, probably literally. Because if you look at his appointments, he has handed the American economy to Zionists. He's handed it to Steve Mnuchin as Treasury Secretary, Goldman Sachs' longtime partner. He's handed it to Gary Cohn, president of Goldman Sachs, who he's made director of his National Economic Council. The Federal Reserve chief, which is obviously massively influential in the American economy, is Janet Yellen, who's a Zionist, and her vice chairman is Stanley Fischer, who is the former governor of the Bank of Israel. And then you look at his ambassador to Israel, a right-wing zealot called David Friedman, really right out there, so far right he meets himself coming back. Jason Greenblatt, he's made his international negotiator, another extreme right-wing Zionist, and international negotiations in all areas of trade, etc., but also in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. So, whether Trump won or whether Clinton won was basically irrelevant to the long-term picture. But there are differences that will make the detail different. For instance, Trump is wanting to get better relations with Russia, whereas Clinton, without question in my mind, would have taken us into war with Russia. That's where it was all building up. And you've got Donald Trump, if he sticks with it, because I call him President Two Mouths. He says one thing and then says another and then does a third. Yeah. But if he sticks with it, then it's going to be more difficult for the global warming hoax to be played out with the speed that they want it to be, because the global warming hoax is there to justify a complete transformation of human society. So they would be good things if they came about. But on the other hand, I think another key word in the Trump presidency is Iran. He's made statements about Iran that are not complimentary. Yeah. He's put in to the Pentagon as defense secretary this guy with the extraordinary nickname Mad Dog Mattis, who's publicly said how much he enjoys killing people, what fun it is. He is vehemently anti-Iran. He's got this guy, Michael Flynn, another military man, as national security advisor, who is vehemently anti-Iran. And then you've got Israel and Netanyahu, a close friend of Trump, who is vehemently anti-Iran and wants a strike on Iran, in truth. Because if you remember, in September 2000, when the Zionist dominated organization Project for the New American Century laid out, in effect, what it wanted the incoming Bush administration to do, it may, and then many of its members became the Bush administration, people like Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and so on. it laid out a series of countries in which it wanted regime change.
Yeah.
And of course, they've been ticked off. Iraq, Libya, Syria, that's gone pear-shaped for them at the moment, thank goodness. But the major one on the list, or a major one on the list, was Iran. And this is why they were all kicking off over this nuclear agreement with Iran, because that's not the idea, to have good relations with Iran. So when you look at that from the Trump point of view, I think that's going to be a key word, Iran, as well as Israel. And of course, we've already seen the other word, which is China. I mean, this guy's not even in office, and he's kicked off a row with China. And when you see where it came from, which was a phone call conversation he had with the leader of Taiwan, and I'm not taking sides over this Taiwan-China conflict. What I am saying is the idea that phone call was an accident and just, quote, happened is ludicrous. It was done on purpose.
Yeah.
Calculatedly on purpose to trigger what happened, which was this rift with China, and he's not even in office yet. So bringing the question around to a kind of summary, I think Brexit was an expression of how so many people now feel about the establishment and centralized imposition. And I think Trump was the same, except they miscalculated what Trump is. He's not anti-establishment. He's just another classic guy who sat down with his advisors and worked out what his natural constituency of support was and what he had to tell that constituency of support to get it to vote for him. And that's what happened. And now, of course, before he's even close to going in, although it's getting closer now, he's done exactly the opposite with his appointments that he said he was going to do. Almost exactly the opposite, not in every case.
There are really two sides to every coin, aren't there, when we're talking about the so-called global elite or the powers that shouldn't be?
Yeah, there are. There is emphasis in detail with different people, but you've got to look at the main thrust. I mean, don't let anyone be surprised that Trump is going back on what he said he stood for, because we have a fantastic example with Barack Obama.
Yeah, exactly.
No one could have claimed that he was going to be different, that he was about change more than him. I mean, it was repetitive to the point of boredom. But he came in and did exactly what he said he wouldn't do. Now, this is another point I think is very important, because in the end, it's all a psychological game. It's all psychology. It's all coming from perception. The whole thing's perception at incredibly deep levels that are usually not discussed. So if you look at what happened with Barack Obama, I was in America talking in the run-up to it, and I remember speaking in Los Angeles one evening at a place called the $1 Million Theater. In downtown Los Angeles. And the big progressive, not least in California, what are called progressives, euphoria was at its peak, because this man Obama was going to come in and he was going to change everything. And I, as part of this presentation this night, I said the opposite. I said he's not. He's just another mask on the same face, and he's just telling you what you want to hear, so they can get in, and then it will be business as usual. And you could have heard a pin drop, to say the least, because it wasn't what most people there wanted to hear, but it was obvious that's what he was, because in the end, I mean, just look at this. Just like the Clintons, Donald Trump doesn't have skeletons in the cupboard. He has whole cemeteries, right? If they wanted to destroy him, they could have destroyed him. They didn't destroy him.
Yeah.
The Republican Party could have destroyed him. They didn't destroy him. So I don't buy this any of this outsider stuff, not least after seeing his appointments. But what happened with Obama is, although he came in and did not stand for what he said he would stand for, that took America into catastrophic attacks on Libya, the consequences of which have been horrific for Libyans, and the same in Syria. Where was the anti-war movement that had gathered so much pace during the Bush administration? Nowhere, because where did the anti-war movement come from? Basically, from an area of perception and belief that people call progressives, the very groups that supported Obama, and in investing in Obama, that belief that he was going to do what he said and was what he claimed to be, and also investing their almost reputation in that that's what he was going to be. It meant that he got this free ride in places like Libya and Syria that boy George Bush would never have got. And it's gone on. He's going out of office now, basically unchallenged by that constituency that would have challenged Bush had he done the same. Now, when I look at Donald Trump now, John, I see the same process. You know, a significant part of the alternative media, it calls itself alternative, in the United States, has got behind Trump. And pushed and pushed and pushed and promoted him. Now, for me, I've been in this arena for a very long time, and for me, in fact, there was no arena when I started out. The alternative media is not there to take political sides. It's there to question everything, and it's there to point out that it's the system and how it works and what is behind it in the shadows that is driving world events and the direction of the world. Once you start jumping on one political side, first of all, you're accepting that politics makes any fundamental difference, which it doesn't. It's there to stop any fundamental difference being made. But you lose your perspective. Suddenly, instead of exposing what someone has done, like, for instance, hey, Mr. Trump, I thought you said you were going to drain the swamp. What about your economic team? What about this? What about that? No, there's no discernment going on among that part of the alternative media anymore. They're mirroring, John, what the progressives did with Obama. And therefore, Trump can do no wrong. Even when he does blatantly opposite things to what he said, they find an excuse for him. And what I've found also is this. Since Trump has started coming out, vehemently supporting Israel, and very, very clearly making statements about moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, which, of course, is a tremendously relevant and symbolic with Palestinians. When they've seen this, they've started coming out and supporting Israel in an unquestioning way. It's extraordinary. We're seeing the right version of what people call the left with Obama when he came in. And if we, the alternative media, are going to be alternative, we have to be beyond the political puppet show. We have to expose it for what it is, a manipulated irrelevance. But I think, the thing is, if you can only see the 5 sense world, that's all you can perceive as real, as existing, then all your answers to your perceived 5 sense problems must come from the 5 sense realm. And if you won't go deep into the nature of consciousness, deep into the nature of perception manipulation, then, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And what happens in the end when you're looking for answers and solutions to what you perceive to be 5 sense problems is 5 sense solutions. So you talk about stockpiling weapons to fight the enemy, or you get pulled back into the political system on the basis of this guy's different to the others. That's what happened with Obama. That's what's happened with Trump. And there is, I think, coming, and I think it's already happening. There is a reevaluation among what constitutes alternative media. And Trump-supporting Trump apologists are not the alternative media. They are at best mainstream light. And what we are looking at now with this great fake news hoax, which came out of nowhere, always watch when something comes out of nowhere and suddenly everywhere, is they're using basically what the mainstream media do, which is fake stories. But we need to be honest, there are parts of the alternative media that do the same. The clickbait alternative media, that's not alternative at all. It's just parasitical on those that are genuine. That they are using that to target the genuine alternative media, which they're terrified of. That which has integrity, that which is looking for facts, that's looking for what's really going on, rather than taking sides in the political spectrum.
And it's very interesting because I have seen exactly what you're talking about happen before my eyes with regard to a lot of well-established mainstream outlets and portals who, I mean, I would have begun my journey with, for example, and they say the whole Trump thing seems to have completely obliterated so much of the paradigm-shattering work that had been done over previous years with this fallback into, it's almost like falling through this back through a glass ceiling into the political paradigm again, or a more mainstream way of thinking, which, if that's a deliberate plan on the part of the mainstream to discredit the alternative, it's worked quite well in certain cases and in some quite high-profile cases.
Yeah, and you're right. That's what's kind of happening, because you see, you look at Trump's basic premise, and that is pro-Israel and, in effect, anti-Muslim. Muslims are the problem. And suddenly, for instance, when you have a terrorist attack in Europe, and some of us still do, but what this part of the alternative media that's got Trumpitis has done is, or would have done, is to dissect the official story and show that actually it's not credible what is claimed to have happened. What happens now is there's a terrorist attack in Europe, and this part of the alternative media, hey, see, it's the Muslims and all that stuff.
Yeah,
it's extraordinary. There is no peripheral vision. There's no shades of grey. It's all black and white, and this black and white mirrors what Donald Trump says and stands for. It's so blatant. You're right.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what the next year brings. But in terms of the travelling you've been doing over the last year, well, longer at this stage, but particularly over the last year, you've been visiting so many different and seemingly disparate countries. I know interpreters are being used in certain countries because, of course, You're giving the talks in English. How have they been received? And have you noticed any kind of difference from region to region? Or does there seem to be an almost global acceptance, or not the case? I mean, maybe there isn't an acceptance of what you're saying, but I would imagine there is a certain degree of acceptance, because once those dots are joined, and I've seen it firsthand when you give your talks over the course of 10 hours, there are so many dots joined that previously mightn't have been even on the radar of a lot of the audience. So what has the reception to that been, and what are the differences between different regions, I guess is what I'm asking you.
First of all, the response has been fantastic wherever I've gone. And secondly, it's been the same wherever I've gone. Mm. You see, when people are opening their minds and opening their senses to consciousness beyond it, to consciousness beyond the program, at levels of, if you like, frequency that are not within the program's band, then they're tapping in to the same consciousness.
Yeah. It's not about words or language.
To respond the same, because when you tap into that consciousness beyond the program, you are no longer Australian or British or French or Muslim or Jewish. You see through that illusion when you get to that level of awareness. And what I'm finding, because one of the things the talk has moved on so much since I started out in the last summer on the Isle of Wight and in London, because, there is not just an awakening going on. That there is a bursting of the bubble going on, and those that are willing to open their minds to it are getting flooded with information and concepts and perceptions that are deeper and deeper and deeper than ever before. So if my talk hasn't moved on from what it is now, by the time I get to Dublin in 3 weeks, then I'm going to be disappointed. But it will have done, because this is what happened. It's a constant opening and opening and opening. And what I'm seeing wherever I go is this same awareness, this same response to this information, and also to the energetic field that builds up in these event venues over the period of a day when you're dealing with this kind of information. Because, it's not just about, how things are terrible. It's about why are they terrible? What's behind it? What does it need to stay in place? And how can we do something about it? It's very, very positive. But to get positive, going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, you have to go beyond the world of the five senses. Then you see where all this is ultimately coming from, and also, therefore, where you stop it coming, how you stop it coming.
Exactly.
And flooding this world with all this upheaval and chaos and distortion, and so it's been very and also interesting, John, is that when I started out last summer, it was the first time, apart from 2 London talks, that I had actually done a public presentation like that since 2011. And so I had 5 years passed for me to clearly see the difference from before, and it is different, and it's gathering in intensity. People are able now to open their minds to the possibilities of things deep in the rabbit hole that they never would have before, and because I travel, or because I talk to these audiences of so many different kinds, I can see it. It is happening. I can understand people living in and working in a certain area and interacting with the same people every day that might not see it. But there is a global awakening going on. And remember, I was on the road 25 years ago, talking to next to nobody, yes, but still talking to people and seeing the reaction. And there is a fantastic change going on. There really is. And in the public arena, this whole Brexit illusion of Trump response is an expression of that. Not of some fantastic awakening, but it's just a sign that, hey, this is starting to seep in now. It's starting to affect the way people see the world.
And do you think then the establishment response to the likes of Brexit and Trump and other various bits and pieces that have gone on over the last 12 months has been indicative of any kind of panic on their part? Do you think that they are oblivious to what's going on? Do they think maybe it's a blip in their grand master plan? And how do you think they will react if it is something that they notice and aren't arrogant enough to ignore?
Well, I do think they are concerned, absolutely, because and this is where this big out of nowhere fake news hoax comes from, and using it as an excuse to by people like Facebook, the T-shirt that doesn't run Facebook, to censor alternative information and to give fact-checking control to some of the worst fake news operations in the world, including the Washington Post. So this, you see, when you're dealing with a perception deception, if you're going to control people's perceptions so that they suit you because of what people will therefore then accept, what they won't accept, what they will do and what they won't do, etc., you have to control the information they receive, because that's where perceptions come from. You can have information in the form of a personal experience, or you could have information as someone reading something on the news. It's all information through which we construct our perceptions. And what the alternative media has done over the years is to put before people, like never before, information that says you can look at the world in another way as well, not just what the BBC tells you or the government tells you. There's another way of looking at it. And because this information is so powerful, it's had a powerful effect. I'm contacted all the time by people and people I meet in the street and stuff who say, I can't believe it. People I'd never thought would open their minds to anything are now hearing a news story and saying, well, I bet it's that, I can't believe it. You're saying that. Whoa. So it has had this effect, and they are concerned about it. They wouldn't be trying to shut out the alternative media in the way that they currently are, because they think it's a bit of fun. They're doing it because they think it's necessary. So that's a sign in itself that they are concerned. And see, there's two things that have brought this about, because it's a psychological game. One is control of information, and two is the fact that people will not question that information. You put those two together and you get the information equaling the perceptions of the people. What the alternative media has done is to show that there are other ways of looking at the world, and that there is a need to question what we were told before, because it's not necessarily the truth. And so, they are realizing that the world for them is not like it was before. They can't get away with what they could before in the numbers that they could before. So it's good stuff. I mean, I take it as a compliment when people try to suppress it, because they only suppress it because they're frightened of it.
And one thing, and I know fear is ultimately what binds us all, but one of the things that would concern me, or I would be slightly fearful of, is obviously the banging of the drums of war, which I think we're hearing louder and louder all the time. And you indicated that you think it may slow down with Trump rather than Clinton, and I would tend to agree with that. I think if Hillary Clinton had her way and got into office, well, I think she would have been pushing buttons as quickly as she possibly could. However, if it's part of the Grand Master Plan, and if we are to see a global catastrophic war that would usher in, say, a new world order, or whatever term we want to use for that, is there any real way of stopping it? I mean, the way I would see it is that people refuse to fight, for example. I mean, how do you stop a war? If nobody fights, there's not going to be a war. We know that. So do you think there is any indication that maybe the economic turmoil that many are predicting over the next 5-10 years, or even in the more short term, could lead to say, for example, the dollar went bust, for argument's sake? Well, you don't have the buying power and you have hyperinflation, all that kind of thing in the States. Well, surely if the dollar isn't worth what it's worth now, the order followers who go into war blindly, waving flags and guns, won't do it to the same extent. Is that potentially something that could derail the Grand Master Plan?
I could talk for hours about this. In the end, it comes down not to what they do, but how we respond to it. See, what they want is chaos. They don't want harmony, because on a simple level, when you are in harmony, you can think straight. When you are in fear or chaos, you don't think straight, because you're not in a harmonious state. So your thoughts become disharmonious, and they can become things that and actions that you wouldn't in a calm state contemplate. So the idea is to throw as much upheaval at us, to create the chaos, not just in the world, but the chaos in people's minds. And of course, fear is the currency of control. So the economic thing and the military thing are actually intertwined. And in terms of war, even with the idea that we get closer to Russia, or America does, You have this alliance. I think you can call it that, really, certainly at the moment, between Russia, between Iran, and between China. I'm sure one of the ideas is to break that connection between Russia and China. But if you go for Iran, then those other two are almost certainly going to be responding to that.
Yeah.
You've got the already muddying of the harmony between Trump and China. So there are many ways of reaching the same end, but in the end, it's how we respond to it. If we get caught in the five senses, and therefore we see dots, not pictures, then we're going to be reacting to this event and reacting to that event and reacting to that event, and the system's just going to have us for breakfast. That's what it wants us to do. We need, and it will always come back to this in the end, we need to get to that level of consciousness, of awareness, of perception that is beyond it, that can see it for what it is, that can see that we are consciousness, and our name, date, income bracket, religion, culture, color, whatever, are just illusions. If we can get to that point beyond that, then we don't get caught in the chaos, because you can see above it, you can see through it. You don't get pulled into it, because you hold a state of harmony within yourself while chaos is unfolding all around you. Thus, you can think straight. And if that doesn't happen, then the world will be in a certain state. If it does happen among vast numbers of people, then the world will be in a different state. And so the idea is to therefore pull us out of states of unity into states of disharmony, widely known as divide and rule. This is why, or one reason, there are others, why they've opened the floodgates to migrants into Europe. Nothing to do with being kind to migrants. These people don't give a damn about migrants and whatever their background. They're being used to create disharmony, divide and rule in Europe. And this whole thing with Trump and Black Lives Matter and what have you is being used to create disharmony and, in effect, civil war in America. And I would not rule this out, John. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I would not rule this out. But I think that Trump is as likely to be taken out at some point as any president since the 1960s. And if they did that, they would create civil war in America, because you would have the Trump supporting half of America at war with the non-Trump supporting part of America. So there are many scenarios that can happen. But the point is, they want disharmony. They want the disharmony to pull us into disharmony, and then they got us. And we've got to stop that happening. And one of the key things is to stop allowing these divide and rule fault lines to divide and rule. Stop it. You're not Irish. That's an experience. You are consciousness having that experience. You're not Australian. You're not Muslim. You're not Jewish. You are consciousness having that experience. We need to get to this level of self-awareness, self-identity, because once you get to that point, you don't get pulled in. But if you don't, then you do.
Well, that's completely true. And it reminds me of an experience that I went through over time in my own life. And you mentioned, you're not Irish. I totally agree with that. However, in the past, I would have spent probably 25 years of my life being staunchly Irish, attached to the flag, and would have considered myself nationalist, almost Republican. And, the north of Ireland, the border, the divide, England, all that stuff, all the stereotypical Irish things that the world hears. That would have been me for a long, long time, even down to the choice of a football team that I supported, or soccer for those in the US. And it's amazing, as I started to kind of become more self-aware and to join more and more dots with the help of the research and work of so many people such as yourself, all of that started to fall away. The less I identified with the flag, the less I identified with everything that fell underneath it. And all of a sudden I woke up and I realised, hang on a minute, I'm not even attached to the football team that I would have had a bad week if Celtic Football Club in Scotland, not even in Ireland, lost a game. I would have had a bad week for that week, or at least a couple of days. And eventually I realised, as more and more people were saying to me, geez, John, you don't seem even to really care if Celtic win or lose. And the honest answer, was all I could say back was, well, I don't really care. I mean, I'll still look out for results, but I'm not attached to the same symbolic flag or team or label or whatever else it is. And it does make things a hell of a lot easier. And it's almost like you've put the wipers on. You're driving through a storm in the car and you don't have any wipers. You're going to have to pull over because you can't see anything. Well, you turn on the wipers on a fast setting, all of a sudden you can see, and it becomes easier and easier, and eventually you don't even notice that it's raining outside. And that's what it's felt like for me. And I was really struck by that, as you mentioned, the Irish thing or the English thing or the national thing. And I think nowhere is that more prevalent than in the US. And I think what you say about the potential for a hot war or a civil war or revolution or something like that in the US, a lot of people might jeer and laugh at that, because I've mentioned that at various dinner table conversations over the past 6 months and have been kind of laughed at or sneered at. But remember, for somebody coming from this land as I do, where the population don't carry guns, that's never going to happen, because what you do, well, you might box the head off each other and get in a street fight, and that's the end of it, you know. But in the United States of America, it's very, very different, because people actually do have guns and they do have ammunition, and they are so attached to the flag or their politicians or whatever it might be. I think there is the potential for something, because there's no question the game that has gone on with regard to divide and rule in the US has been as skillful as you can possibly see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if you go back to the 90s with music, when it seemed that you had the East Coast, West Coast rivalry, which I've spoken at length with Mark Devlin on this show about, who specialises in the occult side of the music industry. If you look at how the black, disenfranchised, ghettoized population of America were coming together through rap music around the time of the late 80s, early 90s, well, what happened then? You had these two mysterious deaths of the figureheads, one on the west side, one on the east side, after the division of the rap community and by extension the black community in America. And you had everybody fighting among themselves and their figureheads were lost. And then what happened with rap music? Well, it ceased to be this revolutionary totem, and it just became another homogenized form of pop music, which had no revolutionary power. And people lost their power because they gave their power to these totems, as I call them, you know. And if the totems are being controlled by the establishment, well, then you're on hiding to nothing. You have to clear that windscreen and let the wipers do the work so you can see the wood for the trees.
Oh, the idea that Jay-Z is a rapper in its real sense is insane.
Oh, it's a joke.
I call it corporate rap. Not only did they take it over and destroy its original reason for being, they turned it completely upside down, and the things that the system wants for people to do, all the bling and all this stuff, became. And violence became part of it. I mean, it was a complete inversion of what it stood for. But see, the symbols of what this psychological game is all about are all around us. A simple symbol of moths around a light on a porch.
Yeah.
That light can be a football team. It can be a sense of country, can be a religion, can be a race. They're all different lights on the porch, and different moths will fly around different lights, but they're all flying around a light. And what they then do is set the lights at war with each other, with the moths, or the lights go to war with each other via the moths. My light is better than yours, and all this stuff. This is what's happening, and like I've said so many times over the years, we don't need solutions. We need to remove the cause of the problem.
Yeah,
and that is the way that people become those moths flying around their particular light. It's what I call my dot is the only dot, and once you focus on one thing to the exclusion of all else. And, football is a very good analogy. When I'm making a cup of tea or something in the kitchen here, or making a bit of tea, I'll put the radio on and I'll listen to a radio station called TalkSport.
Yeah,
and people will ring in. It's very interesting to listen to it from a psychological point of view. And there'll be people ringing in about the manager of their team or someone from another team, and they will deliver it with the vehemence and the anger and the passion that they would never invest in things that really matter. And this is classic diversion. And I'm like you, I like watching football. I used to be a professional footballer a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I'll watch a game, but I'm not invested in it.
Exactly.
And whether I watch it or don't, it's not the end of the world. Who wins certainly is not the end of the world. I don't really mind. So you can experience without getting pulled into the experience and the experience overwhelming you. If you're going to have a bad week, as so many people do, because 11 guys kicking a bag of wind about didn't put the bag of wind in the other person's net as many times as it went the other way. Well, deep breath. What's going on? A few people can't control the world when we get pulled into that. And again, you can even get passionate about your team and really want your team to win, as long as behind that and above that, that in the end it don't really matter.
Yeah.
It's a bit of fun. Oh yeah, a bit of emotion. I enjoyed that. But it don't matter. When you think it matters, when you think it's important, then it's just a sign that the system's got you, really.
I absolutely agree, and I think that's just it was part of my awakening process. Don't really use the word awakening because it's not that I was asleep. My remembering process, if you want to put it that way, because I think we come into the world in a natural state, and then it's kind of bred out of us. But there is one thing.
I think if I used an analogy years ago of you come into the world, and you start your journey down the freeway, and at the end of the freeway is the possibility of realizing what the world is and what's going on. And this system doesn't want people to know that, obviously.
Yeah.
So there's exit points on the freeway, all along the freeway, exit points. And the system's trying to push you all the time down those exit points, where eventually you end up in a cul-de-sac, to use another road analogy. So they'll push you into a religion, and that will then encircle your mind with the wagons, so that only what was within the religion and what the religious book says is something you would contemplate. Gotcha.
Yeah. Or
you might go a bit further down the road and you might get pulled into the whole New Age way of looking at things, some of which I have sympathy with, some of which I don't. And that becomes a solidified way of looking at everything. And what you see with much of the New Age is you can't talk about this conspiracy because it's negative, but we mustn't talk about negative things. So there's a cul-de-sac. Gotcha. Another one might be money. Another one might be fame. They're all trying. Another one might be a political party, football team, anything to get you off that freeway. And we need to keep our hands on the wheel and keep it going straight rather than veering off into irrelevant diversions, because that's what they want.
And speaking of irrelevant diversions, we've seen in 2016 quite a bit, to the point where the mainstream media even started to cover, in particular in Britain, the establishment and pedophilia. And there have been plenty of other news stories that have taken over as things seem to get a little bit hotter, a little bit heated. And we've spoken on this show before, David, about the satanic agenda and some of the potential rituals that go on behind the scenes, and the royal family in particular. We've mentioned them quite a lot. And it's almost like I've noticed any time things get a little bit close for comfort with regard to the reporting of paedophile rings and the establishment, they'll throw somebody to the lions, or they'll shift the focus or have some diversionary tactics. So all of a sudden we'll have a musician or somebody in popular culture. Now we're seeing the expose of football and professional football and coaches with regard to pedophilia and sexual abuse. Do you think there is an agenda at play there with regard to the diverting away from, say, the political sphere or the sphere of royalty, or could that be on my imagination? What do you think about that?
No, I think that's exactly what's happening, and it's been happening ever since the Savile revelations first broke. The fact is, and I can say this after studying this information and researching this information for nigh on 25 years, that paedophilia is absolutely endemic in human society. And of course, we see that. We see it in the football coaches. We see it in all areas of society, in the children's homes. It's everywhere coming up. In the Roman Catholic Church. Wherever you look, you find it. There's a reason for it, which I go into in the books. And therefore, we somehow have to believe that of all the professions in the world, the one profession that this endemic child abuse, pedophilia, does not happen is basically politics. Because they'll go with this head of a children's home. They'll go with this football coach because that's no threat to the system, and it's no indication in people's minds of how deep this goes and to what level of society. But once you start uncovering politicians involved in paedophile rings, especially very, very famous politicians, present and past, then the whole edifice of the system comes under threat. And what we've been being asked to believe is that, this paedophile stuff in politics doesn't really happen. When actually it's more endemic there than almost anywhere else, as my research over the years has shown, both sides of the Atlantic, by the way. And so we've had this so blatant cover up. I mean, when all the revelations came out following Jimmy Savile, and there were only revelations that were in my books in the 1990s, most of them, they had nowhere to go with it. That so much came out so quickly that they couldn't put the lid on. So what they did, as they always do, is they threw it in the long grass. And they did that by the usual means of announcing a public inquiry that has gone nowhere because it was never meant to go anywhere. So they, one of the people involved, who was named to me in the 1990s, Leon Britton, was Home Secretary in Britain in the 1990s, when a dossier of famous paedophiles, political paedophiles, was handed to him by an MP called Geoffrey Dickens. And then after he'd handed it to the Home Secretary, it absolutely disappeared. And of course, then there were all the questions, what happened to the dossier? And so Leon Britton was going to be called before this inquiry to explain himself. So what they did, and it was the present Prime Minister Theresa May was Home Secretary that set it all up at the time. She then appoints a lady called Butler Sloss, who was the sister of a man called Michael Havers, who was Attorney General at the time that Leon Britton was Home Secretary and was involved in the cover-up. So when this is pointed out, and I think pointed out on purpose, she had to resign and stand down after much toing and froing. So what does Theresa May do next? She appoints another head of this inquiry, a former mayor of London, a lady who was a friend of Leon Britton's wife and had been to dinner with him and lived in the same street.
Right.
So that comes out, and I say not by accident, that this was pointed out, and she had to resign. Then they get some really strange lady from the other side of the world, New Zealand, this Goddard lady, and they bring her over, and she's a disaster and goes nowhere and spends so much time heading back to New Zealand. than on the inquiry, and it's gone nowhere because it was never meant to go anywhere. And all these police inquiries, the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday are notorious going back decades for jumping on these revelations and trying to trash them. And that's what they did over the Leon Britton revelations. That's what they did over a number of these police inquiries, and they're now trying to do it with the Wiltshire police inquiry into the paedophile Ted Heath. And another thing that they do, John, you've got to be so frickin' streetwise, is that they will throw in there people claiming abuse that have not been abused. Mm. In among all those that have and genuinely have, and what they'll do is then focus on the one who's making it up, and in that way seek to discredit all those genuine ones that are not making it up. So and again, it's a psychological game, and throwing things in the long grass is a simple process of putting time between that moment in the immediate aftermath of the Savile revelations, when this stuff is absolutely at the front of the public mind, and just throwing it quietly away so it's no longer in the public mind, to the point where people basically forget about it and it's no longer a big deal because it's all past. And of course, what they are doing, it's a psychological game. Just forget about this. And another thing that it allows them to do is, no, we can't comment on this and we can't comment on that because we don't want to preempt the outcome of the inquiry, which is kind of years away. So it gives them a get out of jail card in every direction, and it's blatantly happened. Absolutely right.
And yeah, the inquiries are interesting. I had a discussion with a couple of friends of mine a little while ago, about 6 months ago. We were watching a couple of documentaries on Hillsborough. And as somebody who can remember the Hillsborough tragedy, for those that don't know, there was a football match in England, a very high-profile football match, and there was a crush which was blamed on the fans of one particular team. Liverpool were the team who were blamed, and for years and years, the families of the victims, and I think there were 96, some people may have heard of the Justice for 96 campaign, 96 people were killed. For like 2 decades, more than 2 decades, inquiry after inquiry and cover-up after cover-up. And eventually, in the past year or two, the inquiry discovered that, yeah, there was a huge cover-up and there was collusion between the police in Britain and the media. And basically, everyone was vindicated with regard to the families who claimed that it wasn't the fans of Liverpool who... And there were all kinds of spurious and horrendous allegations pointed out at the victims. It got me thinking, because what you had been saying... and I've said several times in the past about inquiries and the length of time that they take, and how even it doesn't matter really what the result of the inquiry is, because there's so much water has passed under the bridge and so much time has passed, it doesn't really have any effect and nobody ever gets prosecuted. So what was the outcome then for football or for the establishment or for anybody of the Hillsborough tragedy? And I thought, well, that really was the turning point. Football had been, again, soccer for the US, had traditionally been a working class game and was supported by the working class, and there were all kinds of problems within it then, such as football hooliganism and that kind of thing, and it was a bit of a dirty word for the establishment. Now, we also had the advent of Sky around that time as well, and Murdoch and his big business, and he was looking to make more money in the UK, which he wasn't really established in at that point. Well, what would be a good way to do it? Through sport, of course. Post-Hillsborough, all these sweeping new laws and changes came in, not least to do with the powers that the police had in the UK. And I think that was really the start of something with regard to controlling crowds and how the police were allowed to do A, B, C and D, which they weren't previously. But also, in a very, very short space of time, football or soccer became completely and utterly commercialised and owned by big business, which it hadn't been. There was a kind of an independent streak that still ran through it at that stage. That almost evaporated overnight post-Hillsborough, and standing areas were removed in favour of seating, and everything became family friendly. And not that that's a bad thing, it all looked very good on the surface, but look at what has since happened to the game. And I use the word game with heavy quotation marks because it became completely bastardized and something, it became a monster that it wasn't previously, and became a further method of controlling people, in my opinion. And I think the more I look at Hillsborough, and I probably haven't articulated it very well, but the more I look at it, I think it was another false flag that flew under the radar for decades. And the inquiry method was used to brush everything under the carpet until such a time that most of the parents, because most of the people who died were young people, so most of the parents had either become old, infirm, or had died in many, many cases. So it wasn't that big a social issue as it had been in the past. Would you have any views on that, David?
Well, I used to write a column for a football website years ago, and the column was based on footballers' life.
Okay.
Because if you look at what has happened to football, it's mirrored what has happened to society. All the money has gone to the few. You got the. I mean, when I was a kid, there was still a lot. I mean, Leicester City last season was a big blip, but a very welcome one.
Yeah.
But smaller teams could win the big championship in Britain in those days. And then what has happened is this extraordinary amount of money has come into the game. Footballers are not, if you like, men of the people anymore. They are multi-millionaires, the top ones. The clubs have been taken over. The local clubs that were in a local community have now been taken over by vast corporations, most of them from abroad, increasingly from places like China, America, and others. And the whole game has disappeared as the game as it was before. And again, I look at this and we're back to the moths and the light. I listen to people talking about football and supporters of clubs, and they really couldn't care less who owns them, as long as the team's winning. Again, no peripheral vision. What is actually happening to this game? What and how does it affect you? Because of course, ticket prices have gone through the roof compared with what they were before, and denied the game live to so many people that could have easily afforded it before. I mean, I remember what I paid to go and watch Leicester City in the 1960s, and it was pennies. Anyone could go, but not anymore. It's unbelievable, some of the prices. And I remember also sitting in the BBC newsroom. I used to present the sport for the BBC at the weekends in the 1980s. So I was watching the feed live, wasn't going out to the country, but it was coming in from Hillsborough to the BBC, being recorded at BBC for broadcast later. But we in the newsroom had television access to it live. And so I sat there and I watched this, and I saw the game stop, and then I watched it unfold. And I shouted over to the people on the news desk who weren't watching the game, you better turn the telly on because something big's happening here. And I watched it unfold, and it was horrific. You see, one of the big problems that people have in understanding the nature of that which controls them and controls human society is the scale of evil and psychopathy that is behind it. Because people in general are not psychopaths, it's very difficult to understand the mind of a psychopath, which doesn't think like you do. Yeah. But when you take things even in isolation like this, and you look at what happened to those many young children and adults, the 96, you look at the lifelong impact that had on their families who survived. And yet you can have the psychopathic possibility of not only covering up what happened, but actually blaming the victims to cover your own arse. Now that takes some doing, and let no one think that wasn't done in collusion with the authorities, because it was.
Exactly. I mean, the newspapers had the stories ready to go. It was amazing because that's pre-internet, so stuff wasn't as immediate. Yet the newspapers, and in particular the Sun, which the people of Liverpool have never forgiven that particular newspaper, and I think it's not even stocked in Liverpool because nobody will buy it. They were ready with some of the most horrific victim-blaming stories the very next morning. I mean, it was immediate.
Yeah, it's but I mean, when you're talking about psychopathy, because being a psychopath doesn't mean you have to be a serial killer. It just means you have no empathy. It means you have no ability to manifest compassion or anything. And there are many psychopathic journalists. I've met loads of them who will write stories they know not to be true. And they know the impact they're going to have on people, and they have no emotional, empathetic consequence whatsoever. And this is what this system is seeking to do to those that serve its interests. It's to delete them of basic, not humanity, because humanity is an experience, basic spirit, basic heart, in its spiritual sense, so that they will do things that consciousness outside the program would not even contemplate doing. And like I say, people need to start to understand the scale of psychopathy in the world to the point where they can understand that just because they wouldn't consider doing something, it doesn't mean that these people wouldn't.
Yeah, I think that's a very poignant point. And for those that are interested in psychopathy and what it really is, as you've touched on there, some of our previous interviews with Thomas Sheridan, in particular on Alchemy, would be worth going to the archives for. David, I'm very conscious of the fact that you're pushed for time today. Briefly, I want to talk about one or two of your upcoming shows. You're in the UK on the 14th of January in the O2 Apollo in Manchester. You're in Ireland in the Helix in Dublin on the 21st of January, and then you've Slovenia, Iceland and Germany coming up as well. You mentioned that things move on very, very quickly. So can people expect the talks to be quite different? Say, for example, Manchester on the 14th, a week later in the Helix in Ireland. That's going to be, I would imagine, broadly similar, a week between them. But
well, a week between them, it would be, yes. But by the time
let's say we go to Canada on the 2nd of September, your talk could be completely different. It's not that you have a scripted talk, isn't it not?
No, I mean, basically two things are happening. Things are happening in the world. So in the first section, where I'm dealing with the world of the five senses, the world moves on. But also when we get into the real deeper levels and those levels that really are the key to everything, then I move on because I'm constantly seeking greater and greater understanding. So I move on, and so the talks move on. So by the time I did Amsterdam in late November, the talk was massively, in many areas, moved on from the one I delivered in London in the summer. This is the way it works. And funnily enough, since I came back from Amsterdam, I've been started writing a new book, and also I'm doing really big updates to the Manchester talk, which will be significantly moved on from Amsterdam, and this is and then for Ireland the next week, and all the tickets have gone for Manchester. There's 2,600 people going to be there, and we are looking at an awakening. We are, and there's not many left for Dublin. The week after that, the Helix.
So it's going to be a very interesting time in 2017. Just with regard to the book, because that will be news to many people, when can that be expected out?
Before the end of the year. I came back from Amsterdam, and I thought I'm going to have a little bit of a rest before Christmas. And then after about 24 hours, I thought, no. So I just sat at the typewriter and I thought, I'll see what comes. And I've never written a book faster in my life than this one. It's just poured out. I've got up to chapter 3. I've done 35,000 words, and I only started it about 2.5 weeks ago. So when I get back from Dublin, I've got a chunk of time, about 8 weeks, before I go off to Slovenia and Iceland and Germany and loads of other places. And I'm going to sit down and really get as far into it as I can. So I hope by the summer it'll be done.
Fantastic. Well, exciting times ahead, and I really appreciate your time. I also appreciate the fact that there's such a positive slant that you put on your work, and you don't shirk away from the harder issues. You don't shirk away from calling out people when responsibility needs to be claimed, and when people need to pull back their own power. Well, then you say it. So I really appreciate that, David. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in Ireland in a couple.
Well, that'll be great.
Yeah, it's going to be a great one. So
always great to see you.
Absolutely. So thanks again, David. Have you any parting message for the Alchemy listeners?
Well, I think 2016. I did a video cast on my website last week, and it was quoting a Churchill quote. This is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And I think 2016 could be the end of the beginning, in the sense that we've reached a point now where people in increasingly large numbers are looking at the world and saying, okay, I'm open to another explanation. I am sick of the status quo. And that's a good start, because you can't change a status quo if you don't think it needs changing. You just follow it. And I hope that 2017, 2018 and onwards is going to see that this move on. And I think Donald Trump's going to help us do that, just as for some people, Barack Obama helped to do that, to move on beyond the idea that we are going to bring about change through the political system. We're going to bring about change by changing ourselves and ceasing to cooperate with the political system when it's imposing things that are there for no other reason than to deny our freedom.
The website is davidicke.com. I have the power, you have the power, we have the power. David, as always, it's been a huge pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Cheers, John.
And David has very kindly donated a ticket for his Dublin show in the Helix in Dublin on the 21st of January. Not long to go to that one, to one listener. So I'm going to put a question out there. The question is, what is the name of David's most recent book? And to enter, just give us the answer on either our Facebook or our Twitter pages. So the Facebook page is facebook.com/alchemyradio.net. And on Twitter, it's @alchemyradio. So what's the name of David Icke's most recent or current book? And we will draw the winner at random from all the correct answers and get in touch then. So thank you for listening, and good luck with that.
Alchemy.